Friends, thank you for being here today. Right now, across the border, in a television studio bathed in the artificial light of a frantic news cycle, the United States is making the greatest geopolitical miscalculation in the modern history of North America. And they do not even realize they are doing it. We are witnessing a profound shift in the continental balance of power, a moment where loud, impulsive American populism is colliding head-on with quiet, calculated Canadian statecraft. If you have been watching the headlines, you have likely seen the bluster. But today, we are going to look past the superficial noise, past the sensationalism of the evening news, and examine the hard data, the strategic movements, and the profound economic realignments that are actively reshaping our world. Recently, on live television, Washington's top trade negotiator, Jamieson Greer, delivered a statement that effectively shattered 32 years of economic consensus. Hours after the President of the United States stood before Congress delivering a sprawling 108-minute State of the Union address steeped in economic nationalism, Greer looked into a camera and issued an ultimatum to Ottawa. If Canada wants a renewed trade deal, he stated, it must accept higher tariffs, not temporary emergency measures, not stopgap provisions to protect a struggling domestic industry. He demanded permanent, baked-in tariffs. For over 3 decades, the foundational principle of the busiest commercial border on the planet has been tariff-free, frictionless commerce. That era, according to Washington, is now unilaterally over. But the true story, the one absent from the front pages of the American press, is not the ultimatum itself. The true story is how Canada chose to respond. While Washington demanded surrender, Ottawa was quietly packing a suitcase. Not for a desperate flight to the American capital to plead for leniency, but for Mumbai, New Delhi, Sydney, Canberra, and Tokyo. A massive 10-day diplomatic mobilization spanning 3 countries and representing 2 billion people. In this presentation, we are going to dissect exactly why the events of the last few days have broken the foundational assumption of American economic hegemony, and why Washington is rapidly discovering that you cannot threaten to burn down a neighbor's house when they have already moved out. Let us begin by examining this ultimatum, a move that exposes Washington's fundamental miscalculation and marks the definitive end of an era. To understand the magnitude of what is unfolding, we must first analyze the audacity of the American demand. Jamieson Greer did not simply suggest an adjustment to trade policies. He outlined a framework designed to structurally subordinate the Canadian economy. The specifics matter far more than the broad headlines. He demanded open access to Canadian dairy markets, a direct assault on our domestic agricultural sovereignty and the supply management systems that protect rural Canadian communities. He demanded the forced reintegration of American wine and spirits onto Canadian shelves. He insisted on reopening our sovereign government procurement processes to American corporations, while simultaneously stating that the United States would maintain protective, permanent tariffs on Canadian goods. This is not a negotiation among equals. This is a landlord telling a tenant that the rent has just tripled, the lease is void, and they should be grateful for the privilege of staying. But perhaps the most jarring moment of Greer's address was the quiet part he said out loud. When discussing the relocation of the Stellantis Jeep production facility from Brampton, Ontario to the United States, Washington's trade representative did not express regret over the economic disruption to an allied nation. He celebrated it. He held up the destruction of Canadian manufacturing jobs, the shutting down of assembly lines in a city of nearly 700,000 people, as a triumph. This was not diplomacy, it was a confession. It was an open admission that the current American administration views the economic degradation of its closest ally as a metric of its own success. They are demanding that Canada accept a system where we pay a permanent toll for the mere privilege of selling goods to our neighbor, all while they actively seek to hollow out our industrial base. It is a fundamental misunderstanding of the Canadian character. Washington assumed that faced with overwhelming economic pressure and aggressive rhetoric, Canada would simply fold, preferring the comfort of a subservient relationship to the uncertainty of defiance. They expected noise, panic, and eventual capitulation. Instead, they were met with a chilling, absolute silence, followed by the issuance of a flight manifest. I am curious to hear from those of you who have watched Canada-US relations evolve over the decades. Have you ever seen Washington take such an openly hostile stance toward Canadian livelihoods? Let me know your thoughts in the comments as we dive into the data. This brings us to the reality behind the bluster, exposing the United States as a paper tiger and revealing the glaring weakness in America's hand. Why is Washington resorting to such aggressive public ultimatums? The American media will tell you it is a projection of strength, a demonstration of the America First agenda operating at peak efficiency. But if we analyze the timing and the legal realities surrounding these demands, a very different picture emerges. This is not the strategy of a confident superpower. It is the panicked lashing out of an administration whose leverage is rapidly evaporating. Greer delivered his threats just days after the United States Supreme Court handed the administration a devastating defeat, striking down the primary legal mechanism they had used to unilaterally impose tariffs. The highest court in their own land told the executive branch that its primary weapon of economic warfare was illegal. Furthermore, the administration's backup plan, the replacement tariff under Section 122, is a ticking clock. It is set to expire in late July, coincidentally the exact week the mandated review of the CUSMA, Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, opens. Washington is currently attempting to negotiate the economic future of North America using a weapon that has been declared illegal and a backup weapon that is about to expire. They are attempting to project absolute authority on social media, threatening 15% tariffs via late-night posts, while the actual legal paperwork remains unfiled. It is a bluff. The core of their strategy relies on rewriting the rules of origin. Greer specifically warned against what he termed screwdriver operations, a dismissive phrase describing a scenario where goods from nations like Japan or the European Union arrive in Canada, undergo minimal processing, and are shipped into the U.S. duty-free. By demanding stricter rules and higher mandatory U.S. content, Washington is attempting to build a walled garden. Their goal is to make Canada a less attractive partner for global supply chains, ensuring that any product touching Canadian soil is inspected for sufficient American content before it can move. The fatal flaw in this strategy is the arrogant assumption that has governed American trade policy since the end of the Second World War, the belief that access to the American consumer market is the only game worth playing. Washington believes that if they raise the walls high enough, Canada will have no choice but to trap itself inside. They fundamentally failed to anticipate that Canada might simply walk around the wall. Faced with this aggressive posturing, Ottawa executed a diplomatic masterstroke, launching an Indo-Pacific bypass strategy that changes the game entirely. While the United States was busy constructing its walled garden, Canada was assembling an unprecedented diplomatic task force. The delegation currently traversing the Indo-Pacific is not a standard goodwill tour. It is a meticulously constructed geopolitical weapon. It includes the Minister of Defense, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of Finance, the Minister of International Trade, and crucially, provincial premiers representing the agricultural heartland of Saskatchewan and the Atlantic seafood exports of New Brunswick. To signal absolute national unity, the delegation even includes a prominent Conservative member of Parliament who recently crossed the floor to advise on economic security. This tells Washington and the world that Canadian economic sovereignty is not a partisan issue. It is a matter of national survival. Let us analyze the specific, devastating impact of each stop on this 10-day, 2 billion-person diplomatic offensive. The first stop is India. With 1.4 billion people and the fastest-growing major economy on the planet, India represents the ultimate counterbalance to American agricultural threats. Currently, American agricultural lobbies are panicking. They know that if Washington imposes permanent tariffs on Canadian goods, Ottawa will retaliate precisely and proportionately. American corn, soybeans, pork, and dairy exports, which heavily rely on the Canadian market, will be suddenly repriced. By arriving in New Delhi to formally launch a comprehensive economic partnership agreement, Canada is actively opening a market 7 times the size of its domestic consumption. The goal is to double bilateral trade to $70 billion by 2030. But there is a deeper, more profound geopolitical lesson being delivered here. Just weeks prior, India had bowed to American pressure, signing a rushed framework deal and cutting tariffs based on U.S. executive threats. 14 days later, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the very legal leverage that forced India's hand. The Canadian delegation arrives in New Delhi carrying undeniable proof that calm, rational patience beats panicked concessions. We are offering India energy partnerships, uranium supply chains, and artificial intelligence collaboration, wrapped in the one guarantee Washington can no longer provide: the assurance that a contract signed today will still be honored by the rule of law tomorrow. The second stop is Australia, and this is where the structural foundation of the 21st century economy is being rewritten. Australia is a nation where over 80% of the population explicitly rejects the current American tariff regime. When the Canadian Prime Minister stands to address the joint houses of the Australian Parliament, the first such address in nearly 20 years, it is not merely a ceremonial honor. It is the consolidation of the middle powers. Australia controls the very resources that Washington desperately needs but cannot domestically replace: critical minerals, rare earths, and lithium. These are the lifeblood of every semiconductor, every missile guidance system, and every electric vehicle battery of the future. Last fall, Canada, India, and Australia quietly signed a trilateral technology and innovation partnership. Now, through this summit, Canada is supercharging that agreement. By aligning Ottawa and Canberra, we are ensuring that the critical supply chains of the next 50 years bypass Washington entirely. We are building a reality where the raw materials that power the future are controlled by nations that respect the rule of law and mutual benefit, effectively neutralizing America's ability to use technology as an economic weapon. The third stop is Japan. Tokyo is the anchor of the entire Indo-Pacific security and economic architecture. With over $36 billion in annual bilateral trade, Japan is a powerhouse of advanced manufacturing and clean energy. Every partnership signed in Tokyo regarding food security, critical minerals, and clean tech investment represents a structural beam in a new global economic edifice, one that does not require American architecture to remain standing. By creating tariff preferential channels into India, locking down the critical mineral supply chains of Australia, and securing advanced manufacturing relationships with Japan, Canada is actively dismantling Washington's leverage. Every deal signed is a door opening to a market that simply does not care what the United States Trade Representative thinks of Canada's dairy policies. Of these three strategic pivots, India, Australia, or Japan, which do you believe is the most vital for securing Canada's economic independence? Drop a comment below and tell me which partnership you think reshapes the board first. Beyond the diplomacy, we must look at the hard data to see exactly why Canada is quietly winning this economic war. It is easy for pundits to dismiss diplomatic trips as mere posturing. The American media often falls into the trap of believing that only immediate, aggressive action yields results. But as citizens who have lived through decades of economic cycles, you know that the truth is always found in the hard data. The numbers do not lie, and currently the numbers are telling a story that Washington is entirely unprepared to hear. While the American stock markets recently plunged 500 points in a single day, a direct reaction to the chaos and unpredictability of the executive branch's tariff tantrums, the Canadian markets have been telling a story of quiet, resilient strength. The TSX Composite Index recently shattered records, breaking the 34,000 mark for the first time in history. Our major financial institutions, such as the Bank of Montreal and the National Bank of Canada, are posting quarterly profits that exceed all expectations. This divergence is not a statistical anomaly. It is a profound macroeconomic signal. Global capital is inherently rational. It seeks stability, rule of law, and predictable growth. The markets are actively pricing in two vastly different futures. In the United States, investors are bracing for an environment where trade policy is dictated by midnight social media posts and aggressive executive orders that are subsequently struck down by the judiciary. In Canada, the market is rewarding a strategy of methodical diversification and diplomatic maturity. The most damning statistic for Washington's strategy comes not from a government press release, but from the raw trade ledgers themselves. Facing the threat of U.S. tariffs, Canadian businesses did not wait for political rescue, they adapted. Of the estimated $18.5 billion in lost U.S. export potential due to recent trade frictions, Canadian firms have already successfully recovered nearly $11 billion by quietly redirecting their goods and services to 27 other global trading partners. Let that sink in. Without fanfare, without angry press conferences, Canadian industry has already neutralized the majority of the damage Washington attempted to inflict. The United States is threatening to blow up the only bridge connecting our economies, entirely blind to the fact that Canadian businesses have spent the last year silently building a fleet of ferries. The replacement for total American dependence is not a theoretical concept for the future. It is actively operating right now. To fully comprehend the gravity of Washington's blunder, we must look at the growing panic not within the political echo chambers of the American Capitol, but across the American heartland itself. While the administration plays to the cameras with tough talk, the actual engines of the American economy, the farmers, the auto workers, the corporate boardrooms, are beginning to realize the catastrophic price of this isolationist theater. The consequences of alienating Canada are already rippling through the very constituencies the American administration claims to protect. Take, for example, the American auto worker. When Jameson Greer publicly celebrated the closure of the Stellantis factory in Brampton, he framed it as a victory for American manufacturing. But he conveniently ignored the reality of modern global supply chains. Two-way automotive trade between our countries exceeds $100 billion annually, and it is a heavily integrated mutual street. Canadians are massive consumers of American-made vehicles and parts. What happens when a Canadian population, where recent polling shows 91% of citizens actively demanding less economic dependence on the United States, simply stops buying American cars? What happens when Canadian provincial fleets, consumer markets, and commercial enterprises deliberately pivot toward European or Asian automotive imports in response to permanent tariffs? The American auto industry knows this. They know that cheering the destruction of your best customers' purchasing power is a recipe for internal economic disaster. The panic is even more palpable in the American agricultural sector. Just this week, 40 different American agricultural organizations pooled their resources to launch a desperate campaign supporting the immediate renewal of the trade agreement. They are terrified, and they have every right to be. They understand exactly what Greer's demand for permanent tariffs truly means: mutually assured economic destruction. If Canada is forced to accept permanent tariffs on its exports, Ottawa will mathematically and methodically impose them in return. American corn, American soybeans, American pork, and American dairy. All of it flows into a Canadian market that currently absorbs roughly a third of all American agricultural shipments. If Washington triggers this full-scale trade war, all of those American products get immediately repriced, effectively pricing American farmers out of their most reliable, lucrative export market. And the bitter irony for the American heartland is this. While they watch their silos overflow with unsold grain, Mark Carney and the Canadian delegation are spending their days in India discussing massive agricultural partnerships. Canada is actively redirecting its world-class food exports into a rapidly growing market 7 times the size of its own domestic consumption. Washington is actively starving its own farmers of revenue, while Canada boldly secures the food supply chains of the Indo-Pacific. This same dread is quietly spreading through American corporate boardrooms. For decades, American industry relied on the absolute stability of the northern border. They relied on Canadian energy, Canadian raw materials, and Canadian ingenuity. Now, corporate leaders from Dallas to Detroit are watching their own government casually dynamite that stability for short-term political points. They recognize that while the U.S. administration focuses on the superficial optics of winning a daily news cycle, Canada is focused on winning the decade. The sudden realization that Canada is no longer a captive market, but a free agent with global leverage, has fundamentally altered the calculus of American big business. They are watching Canada lock down the critical minerals necessary for the electric vehicle revolution alongside Australia, effectively cutting American battery manufacturers out of the most secure supply chain on Earth. They are witnessing a historic realignment where American factories might soon be begging for raw materials that Ottawa and Canberra have already promised to Tokyo and New Delhi. Do you think the pressure from American farmers, auto workers, and corporate leaders will force Washington to quietly reverse course, or is the current administration too stubborn to back down? I read every comment, and I'd love to know your take on how this plays out internally for the U.S. Ultimately, all of these intersecting strategies and global maneuvers are setting the stage for a checkmate at the negotiating table, ushering in a new era of Canadian economic independence. They are all converging on a single moment in time, the upcoming CUSMA review. When Jameson Greer stated that in-person negotiations would begin in a matter of weeks, he fundamentally misjudged the opponent sitting across the table. Canada's negotiating team, led by seasoned, brilliant civil servants who have managed national crises with steady hands, will not walk into that room as supplicants. They will walk in holding the strongest hand any Canadian negotiating team has held in modern history. Not because of what the American judicial system took away from the U.S. executive branch, but because of what Canada built while Washington was distracted by its own chaos. When the Canadian team sits down, they will be backed by formalized partnerships with countries representing half of the global GDP. They will have locked in strategic alliances with the first, second, third, and fifth largest economies on Earth: China, the European Union, India, and Japan. That is no longer mere diversification. That is the establishment of a new global center of gravity. Furthermore, the consequences of American hubris are extending far beyond civilian trade. Consider the American defense contractors. For decades, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and Raytheon have relied on Canadian procurement dollars. But the delegation currently touring the Indo-Pacific includes our Minister of Defense for a reason. Canada has already begun the quiet process of redirecting a staggering 70% of our military procurement away from American order books, formally integrating instead with the European Union's defense procurement programs and deepening ties in the Indo-Pacific. Every defense partnership solidified in Canberra or Tokyo is a lucrative contract permanently erased from an American corporate earnings call. We are witnessing the end of an era. The United States publicly announced that the era of free trade, mutual respect, and shared continental prosperity with its closest ally is over. They demanded surrender. They demanded a permanent toll. But Canada's response has been a masterclass in calm, unyielding statecraft. We did not yell back. We did not engage in the exhausting, emotional theater that currently defines American politics. We simply boarded a plane in the opposite direction, applying logic, law, and global strategy to dismantle an emotional and aggressive threat. The architecture of a new, sovereign Canadian economy is being built right now. The deals are signed. The critical supply chains are secured. The question is no longer whether Canada will pay the permanent toll Washington is demanding. The only question left is how long it will take for the politicians in Washington to look out their windows and realize that their newly built toll booth is completely empty because the traffic and the future has already found a better road. If this analysis helped you see what the mainstream headlines are hiding, please leave a comment below with your thoughts on Canada's quiet revolution. Subscribe to join our community for more data-driven geopolitical analysis, and thank you for your time today.